go ahead and turn your video off, turn your audio off, and then you won't appear anywhere on the screen. You can still participate by sending your questions to Elise Mueller as a private chat message if you have a question. We do have a large group, so we'll ask questions through chat rather than trying to actually interrupt. All right, so our agenda today is to cover 3 primary topics. And I also want to leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask questions and also give me your own ideas around some of these topics. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know from the research about how to design effective student activities. My focus today is going to be on online classes. Some of these strategies also work very well in in-person or hybrid format classes, but I really want to focus on online for today. Second, I'm going to talk about 3 common types of classes and some examples of the different ways that you can do activities in those classes. And then I'm going to go back to the research literature at the end and talk about some strategies to foster student engagement that should be applicable no matter what kinds of activities you're doing. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions. If after this session you'd like to talk more about how to design activities specific to a course that you will be teaching or are teaching now, you can always reach out to Duke's Learning Innovation Office. We have a group of teaching consultants who are experts in this area and would be happy to work one-on-one. And if it looks a little awkward, I have 2 screens going, one where I have some notes and one where I have your smiling faces. So if it looks like I'm doing things at once, that's why. So I've been teaching for a long time. I've been teaching about 15 years. I teach online. I actually started teaching a correspondence course that was actually on paper, and I would mail assignments to students and they would write on them and mail them back. So I have done this very old school, and I have been doing this online using a lot of new technology for a number of years. The very first time I taught an online class, people were telling instructors things like, maybe you should think about using the internet in your class. So things have changed very, very quickly. One of the things that research has documented over the past 10 years or so is that students learn just as much in a well-done online course as they do in an in-person course. And there are actually some circumstances in which students feel more engaged and more included because online courses can mitigate issues of students feeling excluded if they have things like disabilities, or even if they're just shy sometimes. They feel more comfortable online. So it's been really exciting for me to see the research bear out what my own experience has been, that online classes can be really phenomenal learning experiences. But we also know that creating good quality online classes takes a lot of time. It's not a quick process. So when I found out in the middle of March that I was going to be taking the class I was teaching this spring and turn it into an online class, and I had 10 days to do that, I was in a complete panic, because I knew that that wasn't the time frame that we usually think about when we talk about designing these high quality online classes. But it turns out you can build a really good online class by focusing on some really key important student engagement points. And one of those is student activities. So in my case, the course that I taught did not look like a Ken Burns documentary. My videos were awful, I admit it. They were mostly me with like a blank wall behind me saying about 10 times. But what I focused on was trying to build really engaging and interesting student activities. And it turns out that there's a lot of research to support the idea that making high quality videos is nice, but it really doesn't contribute nearly as much to student learning as creating good student activities. So that's what I want to focus us on today. I'm going to go over some general guidelines for student activities in online classes, and then I'll pause, we'll have a quick break for questions, and then we'll go through some different actual examples. So first, what do we know about research on teaching about how to design an online class, broadly speaking? So the most important thing, and this is true with teaching an in-person class as well, is to start at the end, or actually even start beyond the end. So think about, what do you want your students to be able to do a year after your class ends? And let's be realistic, they're going to forget half of what they ever learned in your class. So if they have forgotten a bunch of stuff, what would you hope that they could still do? So in my case, when I was designing my class, I teach an intro sociology class. What I really want them to be able to do is to hear some kind of current event, some social issue, some story on the news, and be able to critically analyze it and think about it using social theories. And so that's where I started. All the activities that I designed in my class were activities around getting them to that point. So when you develop those kind of big questions of what you want the students to be able to do, from there, you can write out what your specific learning outcomes are. And those are the things that then feed your activities. So my first suggestion is don't start by trying to think of activities. Start by thinking about what do I want them to do a year from now, and then build the activities that are going to get them to the point that long after they have forgotten your name, they'll still be able to do that thing you want them to be able to do. Some general guidelines we know from research about the types of activities that students find to be engaging. First, activities need to be related to those learning outcomes that I just talked to you about. Students get disengaged really quickly when you ask them to do something that they don't clearly understand how it's tied to what the point of the class is. So things like busy work or things that feel like they're just filling time, students pick up on that. So make sure that you have those learning outcomes in front of you as you're designing the activities so that you can be sure that the two are related to each other. And the second is that activities should be active. It's in the name, right? So watching a video isn't active. Reading a text isn't typically active. Those are really good and important things, but what you want is for your activities to be taking that stuff and actually doing something with it. So that can be something really easy, like comparing things or critiquing something, but it can also be more complex, like going out, finding some new data and analyzing it in the same way that they read about in a class. But the key is that they should be doing rather than just listening. And then the last thing is that engaging student activities should involve other people. And we know this because we have them do this on campus classes all the time, right? Turn to your neighbor and work on this problem, answer a question that I'm asking you. When you're teaching an online class, it's a little more challenging, but you can find other people for students to engage with in their home environments. For example, you can tell students, take this idea and go find someone in your house and explain it to them. Go walk around your neighborhood and see if you can find an example of this thing. Go look on the internet and see if you can analyze this phenomenon using what we learned in class. But having some kind of interactive element where they're doing a thing with someone else is one of the things that makes activities really engaging. All right, so before I go into actually talking about some specific examples, let me pause really quick and ask Elise, do we have any questions about these broad principles or research around student engagement?
Nope, the chat room has been very, very quiet.
All right.
Maybe someone, sorry, can formulate something on the fly, or we can wait until you say some more.
All right, I'll go through this first section of content and we'll see if any questions come up. I realize it is late in the afternoon, late in the week. It is Thursday, if you have lost track of that. So we are approaching the weekend, if that has any meaning anymore. But let me give you some examples of what engaging online activities can look like for a lecture and seminar class. A lot of times faculty feel that these are particularly challenging because a lecture seems like something where you just sit like I'm doing and talk at someone, but there are actually ways to make these really engaging. So for most classes, you're having students do activities both during the scheduled class time and outside of their scheduled class time. Outside of class, they may be working alone or in small groups. When they're in class, they may be working with you or with students. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the ways you can do activities in a real-time online class session, and then I'll talk about how you do it if students are working on their own. So first thing, one of the things I noticed when I started teaching online in March, and these were students who had not signed up for an online class, had no expectations about how an online class was going to go, is as soon as we started doing it, most students kept their video off. And so I would be talking to a bunch of black squares that had people's names across them, and I didn't feel like that was particularly engaging. So I had some anecdotal evidence that asking students to turn their video on helped them to feel more engaged, as well as helping me to feel like I was more engaged with them. So I did a little experiment, and I had my regular class session. I didn't tell students they had to turn their video on. I just let them do whatever. And after the lecture ended, I didn't end the Zoom session. I just kept it running. And I said goodbye to all my students, but I just left it up. And out of a class of 48 students, I had 4 students who apparently had just turned on Zoom and walked away because they never left class. And I'm sitting there kind of waving at them. I'm going, hey, they're gone. It's really easy to tune things out if you're not seeing anything face to face. So one of the things I suggest is you certainly can set your own course norms around video. Be really clear with students what those are. Like, I expect you to have it on, or I expect it to start with it off. But you will find that students are less engaged if they're not being seen by someone else or by you. Second thing is, if you're doing a Zoom-based lecture class, you will need to call on people. People are much more hesitant to speak up because they don't have the same visual cues that you would have in a classroom that someone else is getting ready to talk. So if I'm sitting in a class and there are 20 people, I can pick up on whether someone over there is about to start talking and I know to be quiet. And I can't do that on Zoom. And so after a few experiences of people talking over each other, they're just much less likely to want to talk. So you will need to call on people. I suggest giving people a bit of a heads up when you're going to do that. So for example, I might say, okay, I'm going to talk for 5 minutes on this topic, and then Brian and Mark, I'm going to ask each of you to share a little bit. And that way, as I'm talking, Elizabeth, Brian, and Mark are thinking about how would I respond to what she's saying right now. And so you get better dialogue if you give people a warning that you're going to call on them. Third thing is you can use Zoom's breakout rooms for small group discussions. The class that I was teaching had 48 students in it. It was really hard to get big discussions going. I found that I needed to get them in groups of 12 or less in order to get good conversations. So I would do my little kind of mini lecture, and then I would put them in breakout rooms and give them questions and ask them to kind of appoint one person to be the facilitator and facilitate a smaller group discussion. And that worked pretty well. We've heard across the rest of this semester that Zoom's private chat feature is a really great way for quieter students to feel more comfortable speaking up in class. And I saw this, it was one of the first things I noticed when I started teaching online in March, was students who never ever spoke up in my class felt very comfortable asking questions in the private chat. They still didn't want to type a chat message that went to everybody, but they would type one that was a private message to me. So what I started doing was collecting those and not using students' names, but just saying, I see that someone here has asked me if I could clarify what Karl Marx said about the proletariat, and then I could offer that. So that works really well. In fact, I'm suggesting to instructors now who are thinking about fall, even if you end up teaching your face-to-face class on campus, giving people a way to ask questions without having to talk in class is a good way to draw people out. So the next thing then, if you're thinking about how to create engaging activities outside of class time, so everything I talked about there is when you're in a Zoom class with your actual students right there. You'll probably also want to have students do activities outside of class. One way you can do this is by creating virtual recitation sessions. I actually let students schedule this on their own. So I told them that they could either pick 8 a.m., 10 a.m., 1 o'clock, or 3 o'clock. I did not do that for every single week. I set aside maybe 3 sessions over the course of a month and a half and told them I would be around for a half an hour during those sessions, and they had to come to one of them. And when people would show up, we ended up with small enough groups that we had some really good conversations. It also gave students more flexibility around their schedule so that they didn't have to always fit their time into a set schedule. I did also let students pick their own deadlines for things that they would do in those small recitation groups. That was mostly because students felt that they were empowered to take some control over what this past spring was a very disrupted experience. So letting them get in small groups and talk about when do we think we can get this task done, and then reporting that back to me, they seem to really like that. That may be less of an issue if you have more planning time, but letting students feel like they're in control of their learning experience is probably always a good thing. Second thing to mention, discussion forums. So discussion forums are one of the most widely used tools in online classes, and also one of the most frustrating for both students and instructors. Students don't like having to go to discussion forums and post something every single week if they feel like they're just screaming into empty space. So something like, you know, post your answer to this question, that's not interactive at all. And instructors very quickly get frustrated with discussion forums if you're trying to grade them, because it is a massive amount of content and it's really boring because all the students post the same thing because they're not talking to each other. Which is not to say discussion forums are bad. They can be really good if you design them well. One of the ways you can make them more engaging is by assigning students different roles each week in the forum. So you might take a class and say, half of you are posters. You have to have something posted by Wednesday. And a fourth of you are responders. So you need to go find 2 posts and respond to them in some way. And then the last quarter of you are critiquers, and you need to go back and kind of get into one of these conversations and play devil's advocate or bring out some issue that people haven't talked about. So giving people specific roles within the forum that force them to interact with each other is a good way to make those discussion forums into something that's a little more active. If you are going to grade them, I highly recommend, for your own sanity, that you grade only based on participation. If you design an activity that students have clear understanding for what they're supposed to do, and they actually do it, that's all you need to know in order to grade. Because if you start trying to read all of them, you will quickly go mad. Last thing is, when we're talking about outside of class time activities, is to explore game type elements. There has been a lot of research on what we call gamification, or bringing game elements into online classes. They work really, really well. I will say, however, that it is time consuming to learn how to actually build those elements. So if you're teaching this summer, probably not something you want to look at. If you're teaching in the fall and you want to bring some of those online elements in, you probably have time to learn how to do some of this. In particular, things like leaderboards and building systems where students can upvote or kind of vote support for each other's work is a really strong way to improve engagement. All right, it looks like we did have a couple questions before I go on to active learning classes. Elise, do we have any questions?
Sure, I'm just going to summarize some of the conversations we were having. Someone brought up one alternative to calling directly on students is use the raise hand feature within Zoom, so that they can put up your hand and you can see who's ready to talk. We were having some conversations about privacy and having video on and off, and also concerns about people not having the bandwidth to have their video on. Sometimes audio is all they can do. And we basically said you need to have a conversation as a class. Students need to contact you individually if they feel really uncomfortable ever having their video on. What else? I think those are the major things that we had talked about. Oh no, one more thing. Everyone wants to know about recording breakout rooms. It is possible. Zoom will not capture your main room and the breakout rooms at the same time. You have to enable recording in the breakout rooms, and someone who's in the breakout room needs to record it locally to their computer. So where I'm going with this is it gets complicated fast, and I would not recommend it unless it's something graded, like you guys have to record an oral presentation together and post the video. That's when you would want them to record in a breakout room. You're going to talk about 2 questions and come back in 10 minutes. don't bother. If you want to see what's happening with them, go visit their breakout room or make them report back once the breakout rooms are closed.
Great. Thanks, Elise.
Uh-huh.
And you actually brought up something that just before this webinar, I was having a conversation with the director of Duke's Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and we were talking about student accessibility and inclusion around online teaching. And he shared that some of the students have been only able to participate in online classes by listening. They can't talk and they can't have content on their screens because they're in home environments where they don't want to accidentally disclose something. And so he was specifically referring to a class on history of gender and sexual diversity activism, and a couple students felt uncomfortable participating. So I would also add, and it's a great point, that anytime you're having students do something active that engages, that potentially could involve people outside of the Duke community, you should make sure that they know how to let you know if they're going to have a problem. And just make sure that they feel comfortable, that you let them know it's okay for them to reach out. Yes, so I think that's a great point. So the second class type that I want to talk about briefly is active learning classes, which seems like something where you would definitely do a lot of activities, right? As the name suggests, an active learning class typically involves students doing active things. Typically, students work alone or quite often in small groups. They may work on short projects in class. They may work through problems together, but they're basically being active during class time. Kind of the classic active learning where students either watch videos or read content outside of class and then spend their in-class time working on things. I found that Zoom breakout rooms work really well for things like this, and you can move students in and out of breakout rooms very easily. So I've used Zoom breakout rooms for things like a think, pair, share, where you ask a question, you ask students to think about it, they go into a breakout room with 2 other students, they have a 2-minute conversation, and then you pull everybody back in and ask people to share out what they talked about. I also had students do brief activities in the breakout rooms. Like one of the things that my students really enjoyed doing is we would talk about theoretical concepts, and then I would tell them, okay, you have 5 minutes, go in one of the breakout rooms, and I want you to find me a meme, a comic, or something that's going to make me laugh that also illustrates this concept. And so they enjoyed that kind of activity. I also did an activity where I set up a box folder, ask students to go into their breakout rooms, create some original artifact. So in this case, they did an illustration. They put it in the box folder, and then we came back in the main room and we all shared those through kind of an online gallery walk. And then students were able to give each other feedback. When you do things like that, if you're going to put students into pre-designated groups, so if you have a group of students who are going to work together consistently throughout multiple class sessions, what works well for me is to have a spreadsheet up that has those student groups in alphabetical order. Make the number of breakout rooms you need before class starts, and then when it's time to put them in, you can very quickly just tick off people and put them in each list or each room. I was able to get 48 students into their breakout rooms in groups of 5 in about 2 or 3 minutes once I got used to the system. It's a lot easier than trying to use CSV files and pre-put people in breakout rooms. You can also use the random feature, which I found worked really well for things like think, pair, share and answering discussion questions, because it meant that students talked to someone different every time. You can also do these kinds of activities outside of class. So students can be asked to go find examples of things, to go solve problems, to create artifacts on their own, and then bring those back to the class to share. An example of one activity I did was I had students take a particular graph, ask a parent or a sibling or someone in their neighborhood to interpret that graph, and then come and tell me whether or not they think the person interpreted it correctly or not. So you can find ways for people to do these kind of active, engaging learning activities outside of class as well as in their class. see. So in online classes, it's really helpful to make the active learning activities reality-based. It kind of helps bridge that gap between the educational experience they're having and kind of the lived real world experience that they're having away from campus. So some of the things that I tried that worked really well this semester were find a local example, find an example in your community of blank, explain whether a particular concept is relevant to where you are right now, or relevant to some particular news article, or relevant to your geographic area, these kinds of things. Again, this idea of trying to bring family members in, I would caution you have to be careful with that and let students know if that's something that's going to cause them problems. But for many students, that can kind of be a fun way to bring their family into the educational experience they're happening. The other one I did for some of my students who weren't able to get out even into a neighborhood where they were kind of very, very isolated was ask them to go on the internet and find 5 friends and direct message or Snapchat or group me with those friends and ask them a question and then collect those data and bring that back. So any opportunity where students can take what they're learning in your class and then apply that in their home situation, wherever they are, kind of helps that experience feel more connected for them. All right, our last one is group projects. Let me stop really quick again and see, Elise, do we have any questions or comments?
Sure.
Great.
Let me summarize. Actually, I'm just going to bring up some that didn't get answered.
Okay.
The first one that I thought was important that Ron came up with is, if usually you ask your students to talk about something and then write something on a blackboard, you send the groups up and they write on a blackboard to show their solutions or whatever it might be. What kind of alternatives do we have online to have that happen?
So one example that I can give you that I tried this semester that worked pretty well was the idea of putting things into the box folder. So having students type a document or create an illustration, that kind of thing. I've also done an activity where I asked students to go out and use their cell phone and take a picture of something and then just text it to me. And I pulled those into a Google Doc and shared them out that way. Elise, do you have any ideas?
So
Whiteboarding type things?
Sure. If you're in a live Zoom session, they can have them open up a whiteboard in a breakout room and write on that and save the whiteboard or take a picture to bring back to the main room. Might be one idea. But I think it's totally valid if you were in a breakout room, someone's sketching something out, takes a picture, shares it in some way over a Google Doc or something else. Some other people are throwing in some other ideas. Amanda's talking about Jamboard, which I assume is an online whiteboard, and MindMeister was coming up if the students are making diagrams.
Great. All right, well then let me go through group projects here and then we'll wrap up and kind of keep this conversation going because I love hearing other people's ideas as well. That's wonderful. So for group projects, we talked a little bit about class activities, mostly where students are doing shorter things that happen within a class session or between class sessions. But you can also have students work on collaborative group projects that can last all or even part of a semester. For the most part, group projects online work very similar to the way that group projects work in a campus-based class. So you want to do things like make sure you give your groups clear instructions for what tasks they need to do, make sure they know exactly what they need to produce, that kind of thing. I would encourage, if you're going to do group projects, to take the time and meet one-on-one with each group. It only takes about 15 minutes, but give them some clear instructions for what the communication plan should be, what their timeline should be for the project that they're working, make sure that they have some idea of how to split up the work. I did this, my students were scheduled to start a group project right around the time that our classes moved online. It was going to start the week after spring break. So what I ended up doing was meeting with them and asking them to come up with a document that outlined what they felt was a reasonable timeline for the different tasks that needed to happen for the project. It didn't change that due date, but I told them, okay, how much time do you think you need to prepare your first draft? How much time do you need for a literature review? This kind of thing. So it gave them some very clear direction. But again, they had that kind of feeling of being empowered to set the direction for how that project was going to go. It's important to check in with groups often to find out if things are working well or if they're not working. You can usually tell this in a campus class if you are having students work on group projects in the actual classroom and you're walking around. You only need to overhear conversation for a few minutes to get a sense of whether a group is struggling or not. You won't see that online. So it's important to check in more frequently and let the groups know it's okay if you're having trouble working. What we want to do is figure out how we can help you get back on task. So I really tried to normalize students expressing that something wasn't working and help them think about how they could change something about their communication plan or their work scope in order to get things working. I recommend for a regular semester length class, you want to check in at least every 2 weeks. If you're teaching a summer class where things are much more compressed, you might want to check in with the groups every other day. You can put an online form up in Qualtrics that allows the students to just do a quick check-in and just check off either everything's going great or we're having some challenges we'd like to talk to you about. And that way they can feel like that they know how to get help, but they're not kind of being asked to provide or to sit in on help sessions if they don't need it. And lastly, tell students very explicitly how often they need to meet and how they need to meet. This is, again, something that you have to do that you wouldn't necessarily do for an in-person class, but because it's easier for students to become disconnected, it's easy to just kind of say, well, we don't really have anything new to talk about. Let's just skip this next meeting. So I set the meeting schedule for students and told them, these are the days when your group is going to meet. You're going to meet on Zoom. I might show up and pop in and check on you, so you need to make sure you're online. And I did show up and check in on them. All right. So the last section that I want to talk about, and I guess I'll stop really quick and ask if we have any questions about how to run group projects in online classes.
No.
Okay. We can come back to that topic at the end if anything comes up. So the last topic I'm going to talk about before we break for questions is some general guidelines around how to foster student engagement. These should apply no matter what kind of activities you're doing and no matter what kind of class that you're teaching. Specifically, what we're looking at is how you can help build a sense of community among students who may never actually meet each other in person. So first thing to note, when you teach an in-person class on campus, a lot of the socializing that helps students feel like they're a cohesive class happens before and after class. So students show up, they trickle in over the course of 5 minutes early, they make chit chat with the people sitting around them, they talk about how midterms are going, this kinds of things. And that actually is really important for students to feel connected to each other. And so it's important to try and build ways for that to happen in an online class. So I encourage you, if you're teaching, for example, on Zoom, open the Zoom up ahead of time and hang out there. And when students start to trickle in, just make small talk conversation. You know, how's your week going? How are things there? What's the weather like? This kind of thing. Students, encourage them to kind of talk to each other because that socialization is important. You can also ask students or give students an opportunity at the beginning of your class to have those conversations with each other without you being there. So I've talked to one professor who spent the first 5 minutes of each class putting students in random breakout rooms and giving them some kind of discussion topic that had absolutely nothing to do with the class. So for example, get in your discussion forum and I want you to think and talk with each other and come up with one thing that all of you did that's similar over the past week. And it's just a chance for students to talk to each other. If you do something like that, don't go in those breakout rooms. Students deserve an opportunity to vent about being frustrated with a class, because it's what happens in the hallway after they leave your class anyway. So let them have that opportunity and socialize without you being there. Another thing that you can do is to create other opportunities for students to chat with each other. About 2 weeks after my class moved online, I happened to find out that many of the students had created smaller GroupMes. And if you haven't used GroupMe, it's kind of an instant messaging type platform. So some of the students had created small groupings within the class and were chatting with each other on GroupMe. And I found this out because there was one group that told me they had a GroupMe that was called the Cool Kids That Sat by the Window. And it was all the students who had sat on this side of my classroom by the windows, and they had kind of become friends during class. And so they were having chats over GroupMe. And sometimes it was about class, but sometimes it wasn't. So giving students opportunities to bond with each other in small groups will also help them feel more connected to the class as a whole. All right, so that's the end of the content that I have for you. I'm gonna pause again, ask Elise if we have any questions that have come up with the chat. And then once we talk about questions for a little bit, I'm also really interested to hear if you have any examples of activities you've done in a face-to-face class that you'd like to figure out how to do online, but you're not quite sure how that should look. So Elise, I'm gonna turn it over to you real quick.
There wasn't anything new.
Okay, great. And I cannot see the chat, Elise, so I'm gonna let you facilitate that conversation if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
People can also speak up at this point.
Yes, absolutely. I will mute myself even, and anybody who would like to jump in, I would love to hear. Also, if you have any examples of online activities that you've done that worked really well, I would love to hear about those also.
Hi, Kim. This is Ron Grunwald. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I just want to expand on the question and the discussion earlier about students writing on virtual whiteboards and sharing. So in my class, which is a biology class, we'll often do breakout groups in the real world where they're working in small groups and coming up with diagrams and proposals. And one of the things that we've done in the class that seems to work pretty well is that we'll have every group report back simultaneously on the whiteboard in front of the class. So essentially it becomes like a little short competition. They draw out their diagrams and they do that simultaneously so they can then critique each other and say, oh, well, you included this and we included that, and why did you include that, and how did you come up with this, et cetera. And essentially the entire class then converges on a common solution to sort of what's the best answer to a problem. These are sort of physics kinds of problems. So I'm trying to translate that dynamic. So what I heard before was good suggestions about where in breakout rooms, they could share a single whiteboard using one of these sort of shared tools, a common Google Doc. And then in Zoom, presumably they can do a share screen. I guess it's not clear to me because I've not done it before. Can multiple screens be shared simultaneously, or there has to be some way to aggregate those shared documents or images?
So I don't think in Zoom you can share multiple screens simultaneously.
But you can.
You can. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Elise.
you can do it at the same time. I'm afraid that it will be super small and people won't be able to compare very well. Also, if you have, I don't know if it's a possibility, but if you had them create their diagrams on a virtual whiteboard that was owned by you, but they went to the URL, if they all worked in their little bits or their page, maybe it'd be easier. I think you'd have to do a little experimentation to see what is really visible at once on a little computer screen. I don't know. You could also think about let's say that you had it in a Google Doc or online whiteboard, you could have the students go and look at somebody else's in a breakout room, have them reconvene and critique someone else's, and then come back and see what kind of consensus building is happening. If it is too hard for everyone to look at 4 different diagrams at once, but you can share all at once if you want.
Okay, well, those are helpful, and it may be that moving to kind of a serial review rather than a parallel review is worthwhile. I do have another question, if I can jump in.
Sure.
I'm sorry, Ron, can I interrupt you for a second just to ask a follow-up on your first, just wanted to get a follow-up on Elise's answer to your first question before you go on to your second question. I understood in what you're saying about multiple screen sharing, and it's going to be very small. I'm just curious of whether you've tried that in terms of some students have, for me, it's a lot of formulas. So it's a lot of equations.
Right.
So students are drawing, writing the equations, and the resolution of some of their screens seems to be, their tablets or their phones, just seems to be a real challenge.
Yeah.
Is that, is there a solution for this, or can you comment on that?
Right. So I would say that's the moment where you want to be the aggregator of their stuff. So you would have them work on a virtual whiteboard that belongs to you, a Jamboard or MindMeister or whatever works for you. So they're writing there and you're the one presenting it for them, the share screen in the end. And then it's the resolution of your internet and your connection that's the most important.
Yeah, another possibility that I've done before in a different type of class might be to have them in the breakout rooms working through these problems, and then have one person from each breakout room go to a different room, listen to that group describe their solution. Don't say anything, just listen, then go back to your group and let your group know whether you want to change anything. And that way you're still getting that kind of students critiquing and building off each other's work without them having to look at very, very tiny resolution problems.
If I can jump back in, thanks for all of that. I have a second unrelated question.
Sure.
So in my class, we've made good use of clickers in the lecture hall as a sort of way to assess students' preparedness for that lecture. And what I particularly liked about them, we just do a short, a single multiple choice question, is the ability to simultaneously record students' answers as a graded assignment, but also to share the class responses as a basis for discussion. Everybody got that right, or there seems to be an even distribution of people supporting choice A or B. So I know that in Zoom, it's possible to set up polls in advance and to share the results of polls. It's not obvious to me that those can be shared, that they can be done in a way that captures the students' grades. We can certainly set up quizzes in Sakai and have those open, but I haven't used those very much, so it's not clear to me that the results of those and that the bar chart, the histogram showing responses, are those available from the Sakai quizzes in a way that we can do that sort of live and on the fly and share that with a shared screen in a Zoom setting. Not sure if that's clear, but basically I'm trying to recreate that clicker experience.
So you mean being able to go question by question to see the rate of responses and the...
What you typically do with clickers is you'll have question by question and show the distribution of responses in a multiple choice kind of setting. So you can show that half the class said B and half the class said D and a few people said A, and then what we'll typically do is put them in a breakout setting in which they then have to argue with each other about whether it's really B or really D, and then we'll repoll and see if there's a convergence, and that way they're dealing with multiple issues like cognitive dissonance, that what they thought was right apparently is wrong. They're teaching each other, they're doing peer instruction. So there's a lot of good active learning dynamic that comes of that. Plus, it also gives me that sort of formative feedback of, do the students understand the material they're supposed to understand?
So in that
moving
case,
forward,
you're going to want to move not to Sakai. It's not going to give you the results you really need for them to understand the poll answers. Poll Everywhere or Kahoot are two ways that you can build a polling thing where you'd actually see the distribution.
Another option, if you're looking to grade that and you want to have the students' responses in there also, is you can use Qualtrics. Qualtrics has a public report feature. So if you made a survey and you put all of your questions in there, it'll generate a URL that will only be accessible to you. It's called a public report, but it's not public. It's only available to people you give that URL to. And it will update in real time. So you can click on the question as students are taking it, it will show responses come in. But you can also put NetID authentication on there. So you would have a record of what students answered what if you needed that for grading purposes.
That's really helpful. That's probably what you just described as the closest to replicating the, we use iClicker in the classroom, and it captures both that information as well as the real-time responses.
I have an example template of what that would look like. I'm happy to send that to you. Just let me know if that'd be useful.
Great. Somebody in the chat mentioned using Google Forms, and it's not clear to me. I guess Google Forms would be a variation on the theme of Qualtrics.
It's the same type of thing. Qualtrics is going to be better if you want records of which students answered, because you can put that NetID single sign-on behind it, and so it'll keep track of which students participated. It also has better visualizations just from an aesthetic standpoint.
Mark is asking if we'll have URLs to the resources that are mentioned here, as well as the slides later. And I would say we could do that. We could compile some of the things people are talking about and put it as a final slide or something.
Yep, definitely.
Hi. Was just thinking about the course that I'm offering over in the second summer session, which is a service learning course. And not knowing, I mean, none of us know what the world is going to be like in a couple of weeks when those classes get started, how much of a stay-at-home is still going to be in place depending on, you know, and where people are all over the country or possibly even all over the world.
Right.
I mean, I had a student this past semester who was participating in class in Australia.
Wow.
I'm guessing, I haven't tried it, but I'm guessing that smartphones have the ability to link up with Zoom as well. And just thinking, again, sort of thinking out loud in terms of participatory activities, if students are allowed to actually not be completely stay at home, whether they can take their, you know, whether they can sort of go on little mini field trips within their community, wherever they are, and be sharing that. You know, specifically my class deals with artwork and accessibility to artwork for people with disabilities. And so being able to go into an area maybe wherever they live that has public artwork and be sharing that with the class is both relevant to the class for discussion about, okay, how do people who have, you know, choose the particular disability, you know, how would they interact with this work of art? But that also, I think, becomes a participatory activity, and just throwing that out for thoughts, comments, better ways to make that work more effectively, if indeed it's even a possibility given the state of the world in a few weeks.
I mean, I could see you referred to, you know, art space that's in the public. Let's hope that they can social distance to visit that.
Right.
They're not able to leave their house. that.
Yeah, that then becomes a whole different scenario.
Right.
But if they're able to leave, if we are theoretically able to leave our houses as long as we continue social distancing, that just seems like being able to go on a field trip with a group of students is sometimes in our formerly normal style classes, that would have been something we would have been doing.
Right. I mean, one of the scenarios is you ask people to go out and just take a 2-minute video of talking about something they see with art on their camera and uploading it to Sakai or wherever else for everyone to view. You could, in the Zoom session, with permission, you could bring some of them up to play, and then you could all talk about it.
That's a good workaround. Yep. Thanks.
Great. Any other questions or comments people want to share? If not, yes, we will definitely make our slides available. We'll send out URLs and get resources out to everyone. And again, I appreciate getting to see all of you today. And you can reach out to Learning Innovation if you'd like to talk any more about your specific class. I think that's all we've got for today.
I was just going to make a plug for next Tuesday. Our colleague Seth, if you haven't been using Sakai for online learning or just in general, very often you can attend his session about best tools to use in Sakai for online stuff. But this is really for beginning Sakai users.
Actually, I will make one more comment now that I think about it. And you briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the session, how online courses are potentially even more accessible to people with a variety of disabilities. And we need to be mindful of that and be sure that if people, because we're not going to necessarily know our students' disabilities and their visual acuity, and seeing a screen is different from seeing online class. So so being mindful of that and asking, if anybody needs audio description of things, so if you're putting diagrams or pictures describing those things as you put them up is something that can be done, and making sure that if necessary, there is Zoom set up for automatically closed captioning?
You can't have closed captioning unless you have a friend typing away. But when you record your Zoom session, you can turn it on to make an audio transcript. So students who have disabilities or just people who can't stand watching video the whole time can scroll through the written transcript.
Is that an automatic feature?
It is not automatic. You'll need to go to duke.zoom.us and go into your recording settings and turn that on.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add one of the things too, especially for online classes, although certainly best practice for a campus class as well. Make sure that your students know how to let you know if they're having a challenge, and as best you can normalize that. So when I was teaching this past March, I would let students know pretty frequently when things had to change and ask for their feedback. We were supposed to do this activity on Monday. I just didn't have a chance to get it done because it required me to do a lot more work than I expected. So we're going to do it on Wednesday. And I kind of felt like maybe if I did that, they would feel comfortable doing that. I don't have any data to show that it worked, but I did have students reach out more than I normally would have to tell me when they were having problems. And that may have been that they just had more challenges. But just make sure that students have a way that they can reach out and let you know when they need accommodations or help, that kind of thing. All right, Elise, a couple of people have asked about languages in Zoom.
Yeah, I'm on that.
You've got that. Okay.
We wanted to know if the audio transcript would show up in Spanish if you were speaking Spanish. And unfortunately my answer was, please go test. I don't know. And someone else just wanted to make sure that we get everyone gets the URL of the recording of this session, but we definitely will.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming today, and appreciate it. It was good to see you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.